Okay, so the first question is actually something that I've been thinking about sort of on my own. And so I'm really happy that they asked this question. It's should the league adopt the 3-2-1 point system? And for anyone who's maybe unfamiliar with that, that would mean that it's 3 points for a regulation win, 2 points for an OT or a shootout win, 1 point for an OT or a shootout loss, and 0 points for a regulation loss. When I say that, when I float this idea, what are your thoughts immediately?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, there is some merit to it for a couple of reasons. I'll give my first reason first, and then I'll move it over to you, and then we'll talk about the second reason after. First and foremost, there just isn't enough to separate good teams that win in regulation consistently, right? Yeah. Think about it this way. If a team loses 10 straight games in overtime, they will get the same number of points, and correct me if I'm wrong, as a team that goes 5-5-0 over a 10-game stretch.
You're right.
That just shouldn't be true.
No.
A team that wins in regulation should be given higher respect and higher points with respect to the league because winning in regulation says something about a team.
Absolutely.
Right? And I think the current system doesn't do that well enough, and I think moving to a 3-2-1 point system accomplishes that goal. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree with 100%. And another problem I have with the current system is that this just makes more sense mathematically. There's 3 points up for grabs every game, right? Instead of it being 2 or 3, depending on if it goes to overtime. The fact that there's like an extra point to be gained when it goes to overtime now, it doesn't make sense. And that's probably why the standings are closer than they should be. That's probably why guys like Gary Bettman like that. So it gives the illusion of parity even more. Right? But I think it just makes sense. If you have 3 points up for grabs every game, the winner's either going to get 3 if they win in regulation, they're going to get 2 if they win in overtime, and if they go to overtime, the loser's still going to get a point. Right? I just think it makes way more sense. It makes regulation wins more valuable, like you said, and it might even make the end of games even more better because instead of it being like a 1-point swing, it can be as much as a 3-point swing now. So I think it'll make the game more exciting. It'll make the standings a more true representation of the skill of the teams. I think it's something to do. I know the league, the scoring system or the point system is already confusing for some people now. Maybe this makes it more confusing. I tend to disagree with that, but I'm in favor of this change.
Yeah, so one thing that you said that sparked my second point, and I completely agree with you, is that it's going to make the games at the end way more interesting. If you're the NHL, you want games that go down to the wire to be very exciting during those last 2 or 3 minutes. So you need to push teams. You need to incentivize teams to want to win in regulation. This is something that I didn't realize at first, and I give credit to a CBS article that talked about this, and I'm going to talk about a couple points that they mentioned. If you think about it, at the end of the game, if two teams are tied, let's call it 2-2, neither team is actually incentivized to try to win in regulation. No. They are both incentivized to try to get this game to overtime, and the reason is because the upside to winning in overtime is the same. You would get 2 points, and now in overtime, at worst, you still get a point. There is nothing stopping teams from trying to win in regulation. And what that means is that in those last 2 or 3 minutes, both teams are playing with a relatively lackluster forecheck because they want to secure that 1 point. And instead of seeing those last 2 minutes being full of offensive firepower, you're seeing two teams sit back and try to go to the overtime. Now, with the 3-2-1 point systems, teams are actually incentivized to win because if they win in regulation, they get that 3 points, whereas going to overtime means at best you only get 2. And I mean, towards the end of the season, as we're seeing now with Dallas and Nashville, those points really matter for wildcard seeding.
Especially for those in-division games. Instead of it being 2-1, now it's 3-0. That's a huge swing.
Right? Yeah, I always remember as a kid looking back at games that were tied going into the end of regulation and going, why aren't either teams pushing for the win? And I never really realized how it doesn't make sense for either of them to do it. Why? Push it to overtime, get 1 point at least, and if you're lucky, you get the same 2 points you would have got if you pushed at the end of regulation, and now you don't leave yourself vulnerable to a 2-on-1 attack and losing in regulation, right? I think this would do a lot of good for the game. I think it would make divisional matchups a lot better, and it's something that I would really like to see implemented.
Yeah, me too. So on to the next question now. This is another really, really good question. And this listener asked on TikTok, he said, is Sorokin of dark horse for the Vezina Trophy? And this was a good question, because you know what? When you think of who wins the Vezina, it usually goes to a goalie who is one, standing on their head and playing extremely well, but also on a good team. And the Islanders just haven't been good as a team this year. So Sorokin might not be a guy that you think of, but there is actually quite a strong case for him to be nominated for the Vezina. Do you agree with that?
I think there is a strong case, but I think the answer is ultimately no. But I want to hear your side first, because if your answer is yes, there is merit to that argument.
I think there is a case for him to get it. There are also, with due respect, been a lot of incredible goalies this year who do play for good teams, so he might miss out on the votes, but that doesn't mean he shouldn't get votes.
Okay.
Right? So let me just start ripping off a couple of stats here. He has the second best save percentage in the league this season at .927, which is unbelievable. He has the second best goals saved above average at 0.64. And what that means is that this is the difference between a goalie's goals against and the goals against with the same shots against and an average save percentage. So if there was a guy in net with an average save percentage compared to him, he saves 0.64 goals above that average. So he's about half a goal better than these goalies, which is pretty impressive. He's also the second best in high danger save percentage at .865. But the sad part is that Shesterkin leads in all of these categories that I just mentioned. So he's definitely the lock for Vezina. But I think these sort of stats, that he's way better than average, that he is saving goals in the high danger category, which is the most important, and that he has just the second best save percentage overall, put him in a pretty strong standing, at least individually, to receive votes and potentially be nominated.
I mean, those are all very good points. I mean, there's not much for me to elaborate on here. I mean, from all non-advanced statistical perspectives, Igor Shesterkin leads Sorokin in goals against average, save percentage, and he did it in more games. And that's not to take anything away from Sorokin. No. Igor Shesterkin, like you said, is quite possibly having one of the best seasons as a goalie in the last 20 years. And that's crazy to consider that he's doing that in the Andrei Vasilevsky era.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
The one thing that I will say is that it is so hard to compare players across positions. Like you said, it's hard to compare a guy like Sorokin in the net to Austin Matthews, who scores a bunch of goals. But one way that we can do it, that an article I was reading online talked about, is using GSVA. It's Dom Luszczyszyn's stat.
Yes.
Right? Basically what this is it's essentially a WAR stat. It talks about how many incremental wins a player adds to their team. So if a player's GSVA was 5, that means if you take that player out of the lineup, the team's theoretically going to win 5 less games, right? Okay. When looking at Sorokin's GSVA, it's 3.7, and what's crazy about that is it's a full point above anyone else on that team. That means Sorokin's play is worth at least 1 win more than anybody else on that team. He is clearly the most valuable player to his team
this season. Yeah.
And I think that's why Sorokin can make a case for the Hart, because the Hart, like we have said a million times, isn't the best player in the league. It's the most valuable player to their team, right? And when you look at it from the perspective of this player is more valuable to his team than anyone else on his team, it shouldn't matter that he's not the best player in the league. When we look at Austin Matthews' GSVA compared to the next best player, which is Mitch Marner, it's only 0.8. What that means is that Sorokin actually contributes more wins to his team than Austin Matthews does, right? And for anyone who says, oh, does that mean you're saying Sorokin's better than Austin Matthews? No, it just means that he might be more valuable to his team than Austin Matthews might be.
And that has a lot to do with the Islanders not being good. But team performance really shouldn't play a role here. Is this guy really important to his team? Absolutely he is, and the numbers back that up.
Exactly. So from an absolute value perspective, what he's doing with respect to save percentage and goals against average, now compared to his relative performance to other players on his team, does he deserve to get Hart votes? Without a doubt. Does he deserve to win the Hart? The answer is no, because when you look at Igor Shesterkin's GSVA, this is going to blow your mind. It is at 7.4, and it's 4 full points higher than the next best player on the New York Rangers.
That's a Vezina and a Hart candidate right there.
You took the words right out of my mouth. Igor Shesterkin for Vezina, Igor Shesterkin quite possibly for Hart, and that's coming from an Austin Matthews fan.
Yeah, that's an interesting discussion. I think Sorokin deserves a lot more respect around the league. Maybe next year, if the Islanders have a bounce back year, he'll get his due respect. But thank you again for that question. Really interesting.
Yeah, and
to think about.
The last thing I'll say too is the fact that Sorokin has been putting up these crazy goals against averages and save percentages with a terrible team in front of him.
Yeah, terrible.
Whereas like Shesterkin's doing it with a fantastic team in front of him. Speaks a lot about this kid. He is going to be the starter in New York probably for the rest of his career.
For a while.
They have a bright future ahead of them.
Absolutely.